Does rugby need a proper video game? I'll talk about that in this video. I'll give my thoughts and then some of the numbers that I've been digging up on some of the other major sports as well. And yeah, as always, you guys can let me know your thoughts. So the first thing that kind of kicks this off is, I suppose, Agustin Pichot in his campaign for World Rugby Chairman. He mentioned that there hasn't been a good rugby game since Jonah Lomu Rugby in '95. Some people said, hey, you're forgetting about EA Sports Rugby '08. But either way, he said, it's an integral part, or it's an important part of any sporting code to have a virtual version which fans can engage with, which you can use to grow the game. And it's not just children these days. I think the days of video games being only for kids are long done. So, yeah, he said it's an important thing. Bill Beaumont, I think, initially kind of laughed off those claims that it's important for there to be a good rugby union video game. But I think he's kind of softened in his stance and maybe accepts some of the arguments that it is a valuable thing to have. Now, from my experience, a child of the 80s, growing up in the 90s, I played Jonah Lomu, I played the EA Sports Rugby games, I've played some of the more recent rugby games. And for sure, as a kid, I didn't really understand the game as an adult might. Rugby is a pretty complicated game, but I could sure get my hands on Jonah Lomu Rugby and put Jonah Lomu with that big fender his over the line. I loved the commentary, like digs like a demented mole and all that kind of stuff. I really got into it. It was probably one of my more engaging times, because I'm pretty sure when I was a young fella, I don't know, man, it's always a bit nicer to get your hands on it than to just watch it for 80. That's just a kid's thing. But as I said, the games have gone beyond just what kids do now. And you can see from some of the social media stuff and Twitch just how massive, esports and games are. Just to kind of put the gaming thing into context, like I had a look at America's numbers just for PlayStation 4. What were their biggest sales last month? Like, everyone's in lockdown, game sales are going through the roof. And this is just for America. NBA was the fourth. NBA 2K20 was their fourth most sold game. MLB The Show 20, which is the baseball game, was 8th. Madden, the NFL, was 9th. And FIFA 20 was 12th. And that's in America, where, football or soccer is kind of not one of the big sports. It's kind of more of a fringe sport, I guess. So I guess that tells you there is a market for sports games. People like playing sports games, even if they're not that interested in the sport. And I would say, the sales of Madden and NBA and whatnot over here would also indicate that as well. There's not that much airtime given to the sports like the NFL over here in New Zealand, but you can bet a lot of guys play Madden. And if you see the interviews with the All Blacks guys, sometimes they're all pretty into their Madden and they all follow an American football team or whatnot. So, yeah, sports in the virtual world is definitely an important part of it, and it's a bit wasteful for rugby, I think, to not capitalize on that. Here are some of the sports that maybe are capitalizing on it, and maybe some of them that are not. Football obviously has FIFA, and I've looked at their YouTube numbers. So how many subscribers do they have on YouTube, which is not a fair reflection of how many fans they have, because YouTube's a limited audience, but it's maybe an indication. So 8.7 million subscribers on YouTube, and on Twitch, a massive 4.5 million people follow FIFA 20. So it's a big thing. It's a massive market. It must make a ton of money. All right. The NBA has even more people on YouTube with 13 million, only 1.1 playing or following NBA 2K20 on Twitch. So maybe that's one of the ones where the engagement on the game side isn't as much as maybe football, but either way, it's still big numbers. The baseball is a bit more of a stark contrast, I guess. 2.4 million people following the YouTube channel, only 110,000. I say only 110,000 people following it on Twitch. Maybe it's not quite engaging. I mean, baseball sometimes gets criticized for being a game which is aging in terms of the average fan age, but I mean, like I mentioned, it was outselling Madden and FIFA in terms of last month's game sales on the PS4. The NHL, which is one that I'll kind of come back to in a minute, 1.4 million people follow the ice hockey on on YouTube, 100,000 people on Twitch. Cricket I wanted to include because it's kind of a left field one. It's not one of the traditional kind of American sports which gets the big marketing behind it, but it's got a big Indian support mechanism. The IPL is a massive thing, Indian Premier League. So 6.4 million followers on YouTube. But the game, Cricket 19, which I think was reviewed relatively well. I don't really follow it, but it only has 3.7 thousand followers on Twitch. So much more the real game, seemingly, than the online following. That being said, I wouldn't write it off because I looked at like IGN, which is one of the big gaming websites. Their review of NBA 2K20 had 600,000 views, whereas their review of Cricket 19 had almost 1 million. So there's still a market, even if you're not necessarily capitalizing yet on that Twitch audience, so on people who follow watching the games online, the people watching other people play video games. There's still a big market for it. Now, World Rugby, they have 870,000 followers on YouTube, and they don't really have a flagship game, so to speak, of. I know there's Rugby Challenge, I know there's Rugby 20, but to be fair, neither of those is very good. I know some people will argue, hey, they're alright. And to be fair, you could argue that no rugby game has ever been that good. Like Rugby 08, if you look at the reviews at the time when it came out, they were kind of middling, they were warm, lukewarm, positive, I guess, compared to other sports games at the time. They were still probably a yard off the pace. And Jonah Lomu Rugby was very arcadey, to say the least. It was by no means a simulation. It was an arcade-style game, but it was very, very fun, which is perhaps the key thing. So, I mean, there's other sports I could go on about. I would say rugby is possibly in a similar position to tennis, because tennis is a big game worldwide. Likewise, rugby, maybe not one of the number one games. Anyway, I don't think tennis is the number one game anywhere. Rugby is not the number one game in many places. They used to have, I think, topspin tennis, which was quite popular, but they haven't had a good tennis game for years. Their current tennis games are only partially licensed and have bugs in them and whatnot. So kind of similar to what we see with our current rugby games like Rugby 20 and Rugby Challenge. So what am I trying to say with all these numbers is that basically it's possible to draw a pretty big online following for the virtual side of the game. So you're getting engagement with people, maybe people who wouldn't actually go to a game of rugby or whatever sport it is. They wouldn't go to a game, maybe they're only a casual fan, but you're still getting that engagement. And if you get that engagement, you're more likely to get people interested in the sport. You're more likely to get people to actually go to games. You're more likely to get people to buy the gear and just increase engagement for the game. So, in my opinion, does it need a game? Probably yes. I mean, like I said, there are big sports who don't have a good game, but rugby's been one of those for quite some time. I know rugby is a tough one to get into game form because it has more people on the pitch than pretty much all of these, especially they are in play at the same time. Like cricket's got quite a few guys on one team, but you're essentially only having to program like a one-on-one engagement, the bowler against the batter. NHL and MLB and whatnot, they've only got limited numbers of people on the field. Madden would probably be the closest. Did I not include Madden on here? That was a bit silly. Madden has 500,000 people on Twitch, but 6.5 million on YouTube. I don't know why I didn't put that on there. So it's also one that's got kind of a bit of a disparity, but still a pretty big following. So, yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the NHL one because I don't think the numbers, whilst it's still quite substantially more than what World Rugby's got, it's not like 10 times more. You know what I mean? Or 4 times more. It's just maybe almost double than what World Rugby's got. And ice hockey, like rugby, is not really the number one game anywhere in the world either, apart from Canada. Like you got New Zealand, maybe Wales, South Africa, where rugby's kind of the number one game. But in most countries, it's a second, third, fourth tier game. Likewise, I would say, ice hockey, whilst it's the number one game in a few, I don't know, maybe some of the European countries, but I would say it's usually football, with ice hockey maybe being second or third. So it's in a kind of similar position to rugby. Doesn't have that huge market. It's got kind of a higher entry barrier like rugby does. Like football, you just need a football. Ice hockey, you need ice, you need gear. Rugby, you generally need a bit more of a playing area, which is not going to, you can't really play it on concrete kind of thing without messing yourself up. So, yeah, It's a comparable one, but they still get a proper game every year, and it's got hundreds of thousands of people watching. They've got YouTubers, like one guy I saw, he gets regularly hundreds of thousands of views on his YouTube channel playing NHL 20. And to compare like the audience, like if you look at their YouTube channels, I looked at the NHL's YouTube channel to see which game video had the most views, and it was one of the Stanley Cup playoff games. It was a double overtime game, and it had like 1.1 million views. It was, unless I missed one, that was the highest viewed game video that I saw. Whereas rugby for the World Cup last year, England had 2.7 million views when England beat New Zealand. So I think there's a pretty big rugby audience out there. How much of that they can convert into an online following, I'm not sure, but I'm trying to say that basically rugby's got a big enough audience to justify having a rugby game. It doesn't need to be, as I said, a perfect simulation. I think as long as it's fun, that's the main thing. It needs to be a bit easy on the eye. It probably needs to be fully licensed, because that seems to be a struggle. You need to get a few players behind it. You need to get the motion capture stuff right. You need to get the marketing right. It'd be helpful if World Rugby could get involved in that. But yeah, it doesn't seem to be a priority at the minute. But like I said, rugby's far from the only sport which doesn't have a great online representation, but it probably should. I mean, I looked at the analytics on my channel, and the number one demographic is like males between 25 and 34, which is a pretty big gaming demographic as well. So, like I said, the fact that FIFA is a top 20 game in America means there's an appetite for games. If it's good, if it's fun, people will play it. Now, rugby games are never going to be a FIFA because of that kind of niche market which rugby fits in, but I still think if you can make a good ice hockey game, I know that's a simpler one in terms of having fewer players and whatnot. Rugby's more complicated because you've got scrums, lineouts, mauls, and rucks, which you have to kind of gamify. But still, I think there's a market for it, and if you get some smarter people than me, to get on board, then there's no reason why they can't make something which is as simple as it can be, and keeping it fun, and preferably graphically a bit easier on the eye than some of the other entries we've had. But yeah, there is a campaign on Twitter, the Rugby Video Game Campaign. He's had Brian Habana, and he's had like Vasily Artemyev and whatnot. Some guys kind of endorsed the fact that rugby could use video game representation. So if you want to get behind his campaign as he lobbies World Rugby to get behind a rugby video game, feel free to do so. But yeah, if you take nothing else from this video, let it be that I think based on these numbers, there's certainly enough people out there playing games of the sports nature to include rugby into that mix. And the current crop we've got are just a bit second tier and not quite up to scratch. So yeah, you guys let me know your thoughts. Do you think it's important? Do you think it doesn't really matter? Do you think sports can quite happily get by without rugby game representation? I think UFC's got games, FIFA, even cricket's got Cricket 19, which is supposedly decent, but rugby, we're stuck. Anyway, you guys let me know your thoughts, and I'll talk to you again soon. See you later.